Hi, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe, and turn on notifications.
James had always believed his life was a model of stability and success. Married to Linda for 22 years, he lived under the conviction that he had built a solid relationship based on love and trust. Linda was everything he could want in a wife, dedicated, caring, and an excellent mother to their two children, Sarah, 18, and Luke, 15. Together, they formed the typical American family that seemed untouched by the problems that plagued other households. And then there was Mark, James's best friend. They had known each other since college, sharing significant moments that forged a deep and lasting friendship. That's why that seemingly harmless phrase, said by Linda during a casual evening at home, shouldn't have meant anything. They were having dinner, and the conversation flowed easily when she joked, almost laughing, about having 3 husbands, James, Mark, and Fate. James laughed along, not paying much attention. But later, alone in his office, the phrase came back to him. Why Mark? And why did that joke seem so out of place? He tried to push the thought away but couldn't. It was as if a small crack had appeared in a perfect facade, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, the fissure seemed to grow. As days went by, James began to notice things that had never caught his attention before. The conversations between Linda and Mark, once friendly and casual, now seemed to have a different tone. They laughed at inside jokes he didn't understand, exchanged messages during family gatherings, and even at parties. James noticed that Mark seemed closer to Linda than to Emily, his own wife. They're just impressions, he told himself. Small details that might mean nothing. But the idea lodged in his mind like a seed, growing into paranoia. The situation worsened during a business trip Linda took. It was common in her routine as a project coordinator at a multinational company, but this time something seemed off. Mark was also out of town on a business trip, according to him. James, trying to quell his suspicion, checked their destinations. Both were in the same city, hundreds of miles from home. He subtly confronted Linda about it, and she responded with a natural laugh. Coincidences happen, James. Don't be silly. The casualness with which she handled the matter should have calmed him, but it did the opposite. Too many coincidences, he thought. One night, he was in the bedroom while Linda was showering, and he noticed her phone vibrating on the nightstand. A message from Mark appeared on the screen, but the content was so ordinary that it left him more confused than relieved. Did you manage to resolve that at work? It was a generic phrase, but what bothered James most was that Linda quickly deleted the notification as soon as she saw the phone. Why would she do that if there was nothing to hide? James began to realize how much his mind was being consumed by doubts. He, who had always fully trusted Linda and Mark, now found himself questioning every interaction, every conversation, every gesture. He knew he couldn't act impulsively because that could destroy everything unnecessarily, but he also knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he found answers. And so began his obsessive search for the truth, a search that would take him to places he never imagined exploring. James could no longer ignore the suffocating feeling that something was wrong. The suspicions that once seemed like shadows in his mind were now becoming a storm he needed to face. He knew he wasn't the kind of man who would let his doubts eat away at his sanity without seeking answers. And so, he began a solitary investigation, in secret, determined to uncover the truth. It all started with a meticulous analysis of his own house. James discreetly installed cameras and microphones in the main rooms, hiding them among books, paintings, and decorative objects. He reviewed the security footage he already had, looking for any sign of unusual behavior from Linda or suspicious interactions with Mark. But the videos only showed the common routine of an apparently happy family. Linda took care of the house, talked with the kids, and spent a lot of time in the office. Mark, when he appeared, seemed to be the same friend as always, chatting in a relaxed and natural way. Frustrated with the lack of results, James decided to broaden his search. He accessed the joint bank accounts he shared with Linda, meticulously analyzing every transaction. He noticed some payments he didn't recognize: an expensive dinner at a luxury restaurant, flowers sent to an unknown recipient, but nothing that could directly link to Mark. Maybe they were just gifts for coworkers or clients, he thought, but the unease persisted. Phone records were his next target. James spent hours analyzing Linda's call history, trying to identify patterns. He noticed that she talked with Mark more often than he thought necessary, considering Mark wasn't part of her work. But again, there was nothing that proved anything concrete. They were short calls that could be justified for any reason. Even so, the frequency bothered him. He accessed her emails, but all he found were work messages, purchase notifications, and school communications about the kids. It was as if Linda knew exactly how to hide any trace, if she was indeed hiding something. James's despair grew each night. He could barely sleep, mentally going over every piece of information he had gathered. He began to realize how much his mind was being consumed by the need to confirm his suspicions. This led him to make an even bolder decision. He bought DNA test kits for Sarah and Luke, saying it was a fun gift, something to learn more about their family roots. The kids, excited, agreed without question. Linda didn't suspect anything either, thinking it was just one of James's eccentric ideas. When the results arrived, he wasn't prepared for the devastating impact they would have. James opened the envelope with trembling hands, reading the reports carefully. The confirmation was there, in cold, undeniable letters: Sarah and Luke were not his biological children. The shock hit him like an avalanche. For years, he had raised, loved, and protected those children, believing they were his own flesh and blood. The idea that Mark could be their biological father made his vision blur with rage. James spent hours staring at the results, feeling a mix of despair, betrayal, and growing anger. He reread the reports countless times, trying to find some error, something that could explain it differently. But there was no mistake. Everything made sense now: Linda's looks at Mark, the conversations he always thought were normal, the shared laughs that now seemed to mock his ignorance. That night, James decided there would be no more doubts or hesitations. He needed to confront Linda and Mark, but it required more than words. He knew he couldn't just explode in anger. He needed to stay in control, carefully plan what he would say and how he would handle the moment. And above all, he needed to be prepared to hear the truth, no matter how devastating it was. James's anger wasn't just a consuming fire, it was a force that shaped him. After days digesting the devastating discovery, he decided that the confrontation needed to happen in a calculated way, leaving no chance for lies or escape. He waited patiently for the right moment and used a convincing excuse to arrange a dinner with Linda, Mark, and Emily. It was his and Linda's wedding anniversary, the perfect occasion to bring everyone together. An apparently innocent gesture, but one that hid a storm about to break. That night, James put on his best shirt, wore cologne, and tried to appear calm. Linda was excited, thinking the dinner was a celebration of their years together. Mark arrived with Emily, bringing flowers and a smile, without the slightest suspicion of what was coming. The table was impeccably set, the aroma of a carefully prepared dinner filling the room. The conversation started light, like any gathering among close friends. They laughed at old memories, reminisced about college days, and for a moment, James almost believed that it could all just be a nightmare. But the anger returned like a cold wave, reminding him of the DNA test results he had in his pocket. After dinner, Emily got up to fetch something from the car, leaving Linda, Mark, and James alone in the dining room. That's when James, with an almost frightening calmness, closed the door and turned to them. "There's something we need to address," he said, his voice carrying an intensity that made Linda and Mark stop immediately. He took the papers out of his pocket and placed them on the table, pushing them toward them. "Do you recognize this?" he asked sharply. Linda looked at the papers, her eyes widening in horror. Mark, confused, tried to understand what was happening. "James, what is this?" he asked, trying to sound calm. It's the truth, James replied, as he pulled a gun from a hidden compartment in the room and placed it on the table, not pointing it at anyone but making it clear he was in control. The silence was deafening. Linda began to tremble, her voice failing as she tried to find words. Mark turned pale, his eyes fixed on the gun. James leaned forward slightly, looking directly into Linda's eyes. I want to hear the truth. No more lies, no more half-told stories. Who's going to start? His tone wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that crushed any resistance. Linda tried to deny it, but James interrupted her with a slam on the table. Don't play games with me, Linda. I know. And I have proof. He turned to Mark, who now seemed incapable of speaking. You were always my friend, Mark. My brother. Why did you do this? James picked up the gun, holding it firmly but still not pointing it. I should end this now, but I'm not like you. I don't destroy the people I love. So I'm giving you a chance. One of you can walk away unharmed, but only if you confess everything. The other. He didn't finish the sentence, letting the weight of the threat hang in the air. Linda and Mark looked at each other, despair in their eyes. The gravity of the situation was crushing them. They knew there was no easy way out, no magic words to erase what they'd done. As the clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, James waited, his anger transformed into a cold, deadly patience. This was the night when all lies would fall apart, and he was determined to leave that confrontation with the truth, no matter the cost. The silence in the room was so thick it could be cut with a knife. James remained motionless, holding the gun, his eyes shifting between Linda and Mark. Both were devastated, but that wasn't enough to erase the pain he felt. He wanted them to feel, in that moment, a fraction of what he had endured for days, maybe even years, without knowing. Linda was the first to break the silence. Her crying turned into uncontrollable sobs as she tried to find words. James, please. I love you. I never wanted things to get to this point. It was a mistake, James raised his hand, abruptly interrupting her. Stop. I don't want to hear excuses. I want the truth. From the beginning. No beating around the bush. He fixed his gaze on her, his eyes filled with a cold rage that made his voice, even though soft, sound like thunder. Linda took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. It was, many years ago. I was alone, you worked so much, and Mark was always around. Her voice faltered, but she continued. It all started with conversations. I felt invisible. And he made me feel seen, heard. But I never wanted to betray you, James. I never wanted to. She looked at Mark, seeking support, but he avoided her gaze, his face consumed by guilt. James didn't react, didn't blink. He just waited for Linda to continue. It was a mistake, she repeated, as if the phrase could justify everything. It was only once, at first. I tried to stop. I swear I tried. But things got out of control. Mark, silent until then, finally raised his head, his voice low, almost inaudible. James, I was weak. I never wanted to hurt you. But, it happened. And when it did, we didn't know how to go back. James laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the room. Didn't know how to go back. You had over 20 years to go back. 2 children, Mark. 2. His voice rose, but he quickly controlled himself, taking a deep breath. And you still had the audacity to sit at my table, look me in the eye, pretend to be my family, while stabbing me in the back. How do you sleep at night? Mark tried to argue, but James cut him off, his anger overflowing. I trusted you, Mark. You were like a brother to me. I shared my life with you, my secrets, my home. And you not only betrayed me but destroyed my family. You destroyed everything. Linda fell to her knees, pleading. James, please. I love you. It was a mistake. It didn't end our love, our family. The children are yours as much as mine. Don't destroy everything because of this. James looked at her, his expression unreadable. You destroyed our family the moment you chose to lie to me. It wasn't one night, Linda. It was years. Every smile, every moment, every birthday, every Christmas, it was all a lie. He stood up, putting the gun back in his pocket, but his posture still exuded absolute control. Do you want to know what's next? His voice was so cold that it made Linda and Mark shudder. I've taken care of everything. Joint accounts? Cancelled. The house? I'm selling it. My investments? Out of reach for either of you. He looked directly at Linda. You'll leave with what you brought into this marriage. Nothing more. Mark tried to intervene. James, please, don't do this. Let's settle this like men, like friends. James laughed again, with disdain. Men? Friends? You've lost the right to use those words, Mark. You're not my friend. You're a traitor. The front door opened, and Emily returned, carrying a bag and looking at the three of them. Is everything okay here? She asked, her expression curious but unsuspecting. James, still in control, turned to her and smiled as if nothing had happened. Yes, Emily. We were just finishing a conversation. But Emily didn't know she was about to discover that her world had also been destroyed, and James was certain she needed to hear everything. But that was a story he would still decide how to tell. For now, what mattered was that the truth had finally emerged, raw and unvarnished, and nothing would be the same again. When Emily returned to the room, carrying the bag she'd gone to get from the car, she immediately sensed the strange atmosphere. James stood tense, while Linda was on her knees, her face streaked with tears, and Mark seemed unable to meet anyone's gaze. What's going on here? Emily asked, her eyebrows furrowed in confusion. James, still composed, turned to her and, with a calm smile, said, Emily, I think it's time for you to hear something important. Not from me, but for the sake of the truth. He pulled out a chair and gestured for her to sit, while Linda sobbed in the background and Mark shook his head as if he wanted to disappear. Please, have a seat. This won't be easy to hear. Confused but alarmed by the seriousness in James's tone, Emily did as he asked. She looked at Mark for an explanation, but he avoided her gaze, his face red with shame. James didn't waste time. He placed the DNA test papers on the table and pushed them toward Emily. Read this. You deserve to know. Emily picked up the papers, her eyes moving over the lines with increasing speed. As the words became clear, her breathing quickened. What does this mean? She looked at James, incredulous, then at Mark. This is a mistake. Mark, please, tell me this is a mistake. James crossed his arms, watching as the impact of the truth hit Emily. It's not a mistake. It's proof that your husband and my wife not only betrayed me but lived a lie for years. They had 2 children together while pretending to be faithful to us. Emily looked at Mark, tears welling up in her eyes. Mark, this can't be true. You wouldn't do this. Not to James. Not to me. But Mark's silence confirmed everything. He could no longer hide behind excuses. Emily, I'm sorry. I didn't plan for this to happen. It was a mistake, a moment of weakness. A moment of weakness? Emily shouted, her voice breaking. You're telling me you destroyed 2 families for a moment of weakness? How many moments of weakness did you have, Mark? How many times did you lie to me, to James, to our children? Emily's gaze shifted to Linda, still kneeling on the floor. "And you, Linda? I treated you like a sister. How could you do this? How could you destroy everything we had?" Linda just shook her head, murmuring between sobs, "I don't know. I don't know." James watched the scene, his feelings mixed between satisfaction and an overwhelming emptiness. He knew that exposing the truth wouldn't erase the pain, but at that moment, he needed to see that he wasn't the only one suffering. "Emily," he said, softening his tone, "I know what you're feeling right now. This betrayal, this feeling that the ground has been pulled out from under you. But you don't deserve to live in a lie, just as I didn't." Emily, still processing everything, stood up abruptly. "I can't stay here. I need air." She ran to the door, leaving James, Linda, and Mark in the room. An uncomfortable silence settled until James broke it, his voice cold as ice. "You have nothing more to say. To me, you're dead. Linda, our marriage is over. Mark, you'll never be my friend again. And I'll make sure Sarah and Luke know exactly what kind of person you are." Mark tried to speak, but James raised his hand, silencing him. "No. I don't want to hear your pathetic excuses. Get out of my house. And take your shame with you." Mark hesitated but, seeing James's look, decided not to argue. He stood up slowly and headed toward the door, where Emily was still standing, her hands trembling. "Emily, please, can we talk?" She cut him off with a fierce look. "Don't talk to me, Mark. I need to think. I need distance from you." When the door closed behind Mark and Emily, James finally turned to Linda. "And you? I hope it was worth it because you've lost everything. I've already taken care of the finances. This house will be sold, and you won't see a penny beyond what you brought into this marriage. It's over, Linda." She tried to approach, but he stepped back, as if even her presence was unbearable. "Don't you dare. You chose to betray my trust. There's nothing more to be said." With that, he left the room, leaving Linda alone on the floor, sunk in her own guilt and regret. Outside, he saw Emily sitting on the steps, still crying. Without a word, he sat down beside her. Both remained silent, sharing a moment of pain that seemed endless. The air was heavy and tense as James and Emily sat on the steps, staring into the void. The night was silent, except for the whispers of the wind that seemed to mock the pain they both shared. Emily wiped her tears, still trying to digest everything that had been revealed. Beside her, James seemed like a statue, his expression as cold as marble. After a few minutes, Emily broke the silence. "James, what do we do now?" Her voice was low, almost a whisper, laden with exhaustion and sadness. James sighed, leaning forward with his hands clasped. "I don't know, Emily. I don't know if there's anything to do except start over. Apart from them, and maybe, in a way, together." Emily looked at him, surprised by his last word. She opened her mouth to speak, but something inside her made her hesitate. James noticed and continued, his voice softer. "I'm not saying we should force anything. Not now. But, no one else understands what we're going through like we do. Maybe together we can find a way to move forward." Emily nodded slowly, but before she could respond, the sound of footsteps from inside the house caught their attention. They turned and saw Linda standing at the door, her eyes swollen from crying. "James. I know you said you don't want to hear, but please, just listen to me for a minute. It's all I ask." James hesitated but gestured for her to continue. Linda descended the steps, stopping a few steps away. "I know I destroyed everything. I know nothing I say will erase what I did, but I want you to know that. I never stopped loving you. I made terrible mistakes, and now I'm paying for them. I just want you to believe that, at some point, what we had was real. Please, don't let this erase the good years we shared." He looked at her for a long moment before responding, his voice as cold as before. "Linda, maybe what we had was real for you. For me, now, everything feels like a lie. No matter what you say, you made choices that destroyed any chance of redemption. I can't forgive you. Not now. Maybe never." Linda tried to hold back her tears but failed. She stepped back, as if the pain in James's words was physical. "I'm sorry," she murmured before turning and going back into the house. James watched as the door closed, and once again, silence fell between him and Emily. The next day, an unexpected discovery brought another twist to the story. Emily, who had returned to her home, decided to delve deeper into her own children's medical records. Driven by the need for clarity and the recent destruction of her trust in Mark, she sent DNA samples to confirm paternity. When the results arrived, Emily read the report with a mix of confusion and shock. She picked up the phone and dialed James's number immediately. "James, you need to come here. Now." Her voice was urgent but restrained, as if she was still processing the magnitude of what she'd just discovered. James arrived shortly after, finding Emily at the kitchen table with papers spread out before her. She pushed the results toward him without a word. He picked up the report and read it, his eyes widening as the words sank in. This can't be right," he murmured. Emily stared at him, her eyes fixed on his. "It's correct, James. The test is clear. The boys aren't Mark's children, they're yours." James felt as if the world had stopped. It was impossible. How could this be true? He sat down, the papers trembling in his hands. "Emily, I don't understand. How is this possible? How can they be my children?" Emily shook her head, equally confused. "I don't know. I can't even imagine how, when, but this changes everything, James. Not just for us, but for them." James felt an avalanche of emotions. He had lost 2 children he thought were his, only to discover he had 2 others he never knew about. His mind was overwhelmed. But one thing was clear, this was no accident. It was another piece in a game of betrayals that wasn't over yet. As he and Emily tried to process the truth, a new determination arose in James. If these boys were his children, he would do whatever it took to protect them. Whatever had happened in the past, now he had something new to fight for. And he wouldn't let more lies keep him from the truth or from his new chance to rebuild his life. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any updates. See you next time.